All right, and hello, and welcome back to episode 5 of V-Kei The Podcast. All right, so I thought that this episode should really focus on the different subgenres of Visual Kei. And when I first thought of it, I was like, okay, this is great because then I can have something I can go back to of like things that we've talked about or just what are these genres that some of these bands are already in. But there are about roughly 19 subgenres. I do say roughly because, there is no telling when the next wave of Visual Kei is going to come. And right now, the resource that I am using a lot within this episode is vk.gy, just because, again, as I've stated in the past, it's just a really, really good Wikipedia of Visual Kei. But with that being said, I thought I could just deep dive into this episode and just go off on listing all of the visual subgenres of Visual Kei. I was kind of mistaken. All of these subgenres definitely have time frames and different histories. A lot of them, of course, overlap, especially if we're talking about 90s Visual Kei, which is what we're talking about because that is when the term got coined and became what we know of it as today. But to really give this the proper introduction for all of us who listen, I really need to start from the beginning, before Visual Kei was Visual Kei. So oftentimes, like kind of at the beginning of my episode, I give sort of a broad idea of what Visual Kei is and when it began. And as we know, oftentimes people say that it began in the 80s, which is true to some extent. The reason why it's true to some extent is because, yes, some of our favorite artists may have started in the late 80s. But the time periods are kind of the biggest flags, meaning that it really wasn't until Visual Kei was used was that then it being introduced in the 90s. Does that make sense? So what we're going to do here is actually kind of start off with the very beginning, before Visual Kei was Visual Kei. So again, like I said, a lot of my reference comes from vk.gy. If there's ever a band that you want to know more about, that is the place that you want to go to. I mean, it's all user content, but they do some really thorough research. So it first started off, instead of it being known as Visual Kei in the 80s, it definitely started off as Okesho Kei. All right, so Okesho Kei, basically Okesho means makeup. Like what you put on your face, makeup, eyeliner, all that good stuff. But this is not a genre or a subgenre of Visual Kei. Instead, this is a trend. What this really focuses on was basically the start of extravagant hair, makeup, and costumes becoming something more noticeable in Japanese music, and specifically, obviously, Japanese rock music. At the time of the early 80s, Japan was having a really big rock band boom, so this was a way for these artists to stand out. They were doing anything they could to be able to stand out. So with Okesho Kei, it obviously had some Western influences from the 70s with hard rock and glam rock influences, like obviously Kiss, David Bowie, and bands like that. You've got the tight pants, you've got the extravagant face makeup, you've got the teased hair, and kind of the first known artist to really start this trend was an artist named Sawada Kenji. He really was sort of known for wearing the feminine androgynous makeup, colored contacts, bloody bandages, military outfits, popular. And that was kind of at the end of the 70s. In terms of a band, we had also at the end of the 70s, we had a rock band called Novella. They were a progressive rock band, um, and they kind of were the group other Japanese bands began to imitate and inspire. Um, their outfits and looks consisted of teased hair, platforms, leg warmers. They definitely took a lot of inspiration from glam rock. Um, they took a lot of inspiration from glam rock. It's actually really important to note though that this obviously gained a huge following, female following. What can we say? A lot of us, including myself, are down bad for a pretty man. Um, but this is also kind of the start of the bangya culture that we know of today in Visual Kei. Women would gather outside of live houses with their bleached hair. They would be teased for days. They would wear heavy makeup, and then on top of it, would wear frilly dresses, and oftentimes kind of like the similar style, which is what you will see when you go to a Visual Kei concert. Each fan base has a specific look that a lot of people conform to. In the 80s is when we can start introducing the Japanese metal boom. So this is when we were starting to get a little bit darker. Again, still not Visual Kei, still that term was not used. But really, the mid 80s is when a lot of things started to happen, because that's when we could start hearing the sound that we know Visual Kei to be as. And as we know, obviously there are so many subgenres. Each band sounds relatively different, but like, again, just going back to that heavy metal sound, that thrash music sound, some maybe even synth music being popped in there. That was the mid 80s. And the band that really kind of kicked off that sound was a group called Dead End. And this is also when people were starting to take note how important indie music and independent artists were becoming and how influential they were. A lot of independent record labels started to take off around this time with a whole bunch of different genres, like I said, of rock, punk, metal, and so on. Going back to the fan base thing, in the mid 80s, there were two pretty notable record labels. One was called Trans Records, and one is called Nagomu Records. And this is really where. So, as I kind of stated with the band, what I kind of stated with the band, who was it? Novella, right? With their leg warmers, hair, platforms, where it then inspired their fan base to sort of be on the cutesy side, but wear the heavy makeup and all of that. And again, that's more of their female fans. These two record labels really kind of honed in on that concept. This is where like illustrations were starting to be created of what these bands' female fans were looking like. Again, just sort of getting that gals culture there, the really solidifying bangya culture. Again, the teased hair, the rebellious looks, hanging out at the concert venues, all of that. And with each of these records, they did have like specific styling that sort of went along, but that's just because that's kind of what everyone kind of agreed to. It wasn't like they were pushing that at the beginning of their record label, but as that became to be something that it was noticeable, it further solidified that concept. In the late 80s is when we can start seeing our Visual Kei pioneers start to pop up, the ones that we know of today, like Buck Tick and X Japan. It's kind of hard to basically be like, this is when Okashoke, which is a trend, not a genre, um, ended, and this is when Visual Kei began. It's not as black and white as this date is when this happened, this date is when this happened. However, the first use of the words Visual Kei in publication was a magazine called Show in 1993, and at that point, the rest was history. That is what bands began to identify themselves as. So, with that being said, obviously, what we know with Visual Kei, it being basically a huge opening, a huge, what's the word that I'm looking for? Um, it's basically a broad genre of a bunch of different bands. The, and the overlap of some of these bands, especially as we get from the late 80s to the early 90s, a lot of these bands, especially the ones that we know that have been around for a while, obviously sort of change within the trends and the times, whether they're the ones that created the new trends or they're the ones that also just sort of follow suit. So the first subgenre that was, I guess, also kind of like the very first type of Visual Kei, was Kurofukuke. All right, that's the first subgenre that we're going to talk about, and the rough time period is 1990 to 1994. With Kurofukuke, while it definitely has like some semi end date, obviously other subgenres continue to evolve from this. So their characteristics are black clothing, mostly teased hair, as we know, the makeup, the tailored suits, leather pants, sometimes oversized tops that could be flowy, beads, pearls, studs, chokers, fur, just overall moody. And then sometimes you would see pops of color, like you might see like the red hair, all the band members have red hair, or something like that, right? The music style was really considered beat rock, which is that they beat rock is a sound that again came from Western, like you know the UK and stuff like that. But it did eventually evolve into something a little darker, known as decadent beat rock. Beat rock, still beat rock. Beat rock basically, sorry, not beat rock. Kurofukuke became popular with a group called Bowie, but it was towards the end of their career when they transitioned to this, and so they were then succeeded by Bucktick, who we all know. And the whole purpose of me going into these subgenres is not necessarily to deep dive into all these specific bands that sort of started it, but it is to give us a little bit of background, and then, of course, I will eventually do an episode that is dedicated to all of these type of groups. But just to give kind of a little bit of background with Kurofukuke. So we have Bucktick. We've seen some of the images. We've seen the dark look. We've seen the black and the drapey and the flowy. Their album Aku no Hana and V-Kei's Close Dance and excuse me for this, the Erlanger's Basilisk are basically known as the three Bibles of Kurofukuke. So each of those albums mixed different genres of rock, again, where it was like some of it was that heavy metal, some of it was pop, positive punk, some of it was thrash, and then of course what Bucktick brought to it was some decadent beat rock. Luna Sea was the next to sort of continue that trend of Kurofukuke after their first release of their album Luna Sea. But just to give how like some of the namings of these Visual Kei dramas are just so specific. Like literally Kurofukuke literally translates to black clothing style. So it's not like it's some far off niche type name. No, it's really like this is what it is. This is what you're going to see. So that was kind of what Kurofukuke was. And as I kind of said, around 1994 is when bands started adapting. Either they've disbanded or they started adapting into other styles. Visual Kei is fluid. So a lot of these bands will mix with other things, especially in the 90s and so on. I think now with current day Visual Kei, a lot of them do stay within their box. They may do an album or experiment with something that's outside of the realm of what they produce normally. But I think they know the fans that basically what you get is what is being asked for. Like that's what we want to see. But then it reminds me of groups like Kiryu where they were like, let's do a subgroup that's a whole different concept. We're gonna act as idols. We're gonna dance and whatever, and call ourselves Dragon. Like, okay, they can still have the fun part in it as well. Um, but that technically leads us to our next subgenre. And I'm following the order of V-Kei.gy because I think that is going to allow for me to have the easiest concept and breakdown of these subgenres. Because a lot of them are, like I said, time specific. So our next style is Nagoya Kei. That was roughly 1993 to 2004. As you see, we have an overlap with Kurofuku Kei. Perfectly fine. Nagoya Kei is interesting because of the fact that it is region specific. And I'm really kind of mad at myself from not necessarily realizing when I studied abroad in Nagoya that this was a thing. I mean, maybe not as much of a thing as it was in the 1993 to 2004 time, but I mean, this is a capital of Aichi Prefecture that had such an impact that people were like, nah, this is specifically Nagoya Kei. And yes, technically, you should be from Nagoya or Aichi Prefecture to be able to hold this quote unquote title. But their sounds are pretty much, again, sort of that dark, gloomy, theatrical, positive punk influence. There was a second wave that occurred, which could be even more gloomy, slow, poetic, really bass heavy. So in terms of what they visually look like, again, theatrical without being too much. This is important. With a lot of Visual Kei, what we see is a lot of quote unquote clashing. I wouldn't, not in a negative way, but a lot of things sometimes piled on top. Nagoya Kei was going for a more moody, simplistic kind of route. Still sort of not as costumey, but definitely black and white clothing, tight plants, flowy tops. Their makeup was a little bit more sickly to make them look a little more sickly. Towards the second wave is when gauzes and spider webs were sort of introduced. But again, region specific, and I kind of love that. They're the only one on this group where it's like this is from this area. So some of the notable bands was Silver Rose. They also fell under the Kurofuku Kei. And then we have Kuroyume, which again they had a more darker and more violent sort of look about themselves. And so Nagoya Kei also was coined from a magazine. Kuroyume, Kuroyume sort of became that breakout artist that put Nagoya Kei on the map. They got their nationwide fandom type thing. And they kind of put, as I said, they sort of put Nagoya Kei on the map. So those bands coming after Kuroyume sort of followed Kuroyume's path and music style. Some of Nagoya Kei also kind of transformed into the positive punk era, which kind of goes and sounds very similar to Kurofuku Kei. Some notable bands from that was Auto Mode and Lucifer, Luscious, Violence. But anyways, they were more dark. It was darker and more theatrical. Nagoya Kei bands, and this is a quote directly, are said to be more interconnected than most V-Kei groups, because what was very interesting about this, and I'm excited to sort of dive into some other Nagoya Kei bands, is they really had the reputation of swapping members to an extreme degree. So I think a lot of them just perform with each other and they enjoy doing that. So that is kind of what tied Nagoya Kei together, made them really special. Okay, the last one that we're going to go over today is Shiro Kei, right? I think, no. This is not the last one. I lied. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Shiro Kei. Shiro Kei still kind of at this point gets referenced today as well. But basically, Shiro Kei took off in 1993. And again, it is exactly as it sounds. Shiro meaning white, and Kei meaning style. So that was the style. They dressed in white. It's not very, like, I find it again interesting that some of these, well, they're definitely, even with Shiro Kei, there is still a sound that goes along with it. I find that it's so interesting that the titles are just so blanket. Like, it's just what you are saying is what you are saying. So basically with Shiro Kei, with white style, meaning one or more members were dressed in almost all white. This obviously was a huge contrast to Kurofuku Kei, and it basically it was another genre that, like, spurred a moment. And also it made you stand out a lot. Like, I think definitely as this was coming along, that's not what Visual Kei was known for, right? The Visual Kei was known for its darker looks. But with Shiro Kei coming in, it basically, made them a beacon, a light, so to speak. So with this, the style, again, like I said, one or more members are dressed in white. Oftentimes, it's the vocalist that's dressed in white. Everyone else might be dressed in more neutral colors or black. Flowy, oversized. Think very magical. Feathers, flowers, lace. Really fantastic setting, like fantastical. Sometimes it would use Paris as that, like, romance dream. And then this was also the introduction of more feminine type hairstyles. And so, like, as we had in the early 90s, which is still 1993, so this is still early 90s. But if we're talking about late 80s, early 90s, where it was a lot of teased hair standing straight up, this is now hair kind of down, right? We're dealing with luscious locks here. Basically, the sound itself is still is rock music. The only thing is this is more melodic in tone. So the melody is very important. They were pleasant. The songs were pleasant. They were pretty. There was rarely any, like, of course there's going to be some where there was screaming and sort of violent guitar riffs and whatever, but rarely that happened. There was rarely any violent screams or shouting happening. And even for a lot of us to this day, could definitely say that there was a nostalgic sound to it. And of course, a band that really made this genre famous, I'm sure we can guess. I'm sure we could. Les Arc-en-Ciel. They started off as a Kurofuku Kei band. But they basically transitioned into Shiro Kei when they Shiro Kei when they realized they could they could basically capitalize on Hide's vocals and the visuals. He already had the long, luscious locks. He had a soft face. He was he still is, a gorgeous man. And really, it was their first album, because like I said, they were a Kurofuku Kei band starting off. And I think, again, that seems about the right path for most Visual Kei bands in the early 90s. But once they released their first album, it was a much more delicate sound. Obviously, I'm going to take the time to do a deep dive on this band, but I don't want to spend but so much time on this. But another band that also picked up the Shido-kei vibes was Lacrima Christi. I think I'm saying that right. Um, these two bands basically brought the technicality back to Visual Kei, because at one point Visual Kei was kind of known of just, and I think this comes from, I could be wrong, but I do think this comes from the, if we go back to the whole thrash metal and stuff like that, but okishoke trend, right? The necessarily the musicians didn't have to be great musicians. Like, your drummer didn't necessarily have to always be on time, on beat. There were mistakes in like guitar and bass, but that was perfectly fine. It was acceptable. But I do think when Shiro K came along, it started to be refined. Not to say, of course, I'm not saying that bands that are part of the Kurofuku Kei are the same way. I remember giving a presentation that was only supposed to be, I think, a 15-minute presentation, lasted 30 minutes. I do not know why my professor did not stop me, about Visual Kei. And one of the things that was really honed in, especially in earlier stages of Visual Kei, before it was like it is now, where it is easier to fix minor mistakes. It was, you had to be a talented musician. And I'm, like I said, I'm not saying that they were not talented musicians before this. It's just that what the sound that was produced was a much cleaner sound than what was needed in something like Kurofuku Kei or Okisho Kei, right? But again, really brought that technical skill and technical sound back. Really solidifying the whole, they have to be good musicians. And definitely there are still bands that will use Shido-kei as a concept at some point, right? So the last one that we are going to touch base on is soft visuals. This came between 1995 and 2005, and honestly, again, we could say that this is kind of still a constant. It is not unheard of for our older Visual Kei bands to eventually lead to this type of track where they simplify their looks. This is not necessarily, again, going back to, this is not necessarily a sound issue. Meaning, like, if a band was Kurofuku Kei, they were still technically Kurofuku Kei. They just now have softened some of their visuals. But there is a sound that goes with soft visual, which I will go into now. So again, less visual. So what we're dealing with is less makeup, minimal hairstyles, more professional attire. Basically, the people that are on stage looks like people that you could see on the street. So it was like regular streetwear or sometimes tailored suits. They just look like your average person. But we knew them as Visual Kei because they were bands that were already under other subgenres. During this era, pop rock began to be a thing, just because pop rock began to be a much more digestible sound to the public. I'm thinking we're coming into that shift of where bands wanted to break out from being the independent label, and actually around this time, a lot of the bands that I've talked about or got onto major labels around this time. Some of them a little earlier, but if you're on a major label, they're gonna eventually probably try to change your sound, whether that's a U option or not. Especially because they want people to be able to, they want more people to be able to listen to this music. That is more lucrative to the label. But also, so with this subgenre, it was just basically toned down Visual Kei. And the quote that I will say multiple times is, Visual Kei your parents can listen to. That's just like music that I listen to now. I'm like, there are some things where I'm like, oh yeah, my parents could totally be fine with this playing in the car, and there's some things where I'm like, oh, this is not something that I want my parents to listen to, and or they don't want to listen to. Going back to the bands that made soft visual popular, and again, what was a big signifier of soft visual was that they chopped their hair. They no longer had the long, luscious hair. They no longer had the teased hair. They had a much more tailored, normal look. And some of those bands that made that popular, of course, was Kuroyume, Lunacy, Bugtick, X Japan, L'Arc-en-Ciel, V-Kei. Bands that I had literally just mentioned a minute ago. But you have to admit, like, at some point, you as an artist, or even as a person that's listening, is like, I'm getting older. I cannot keep doing the things on stage. And honestly, they were not that old at the time anyways. But the reality is what musicians want is longevity. So at some point, they may need to cut back. That's not true for all. We definitely know there are definitely some musicians that keep up with the theatrics, and we will get to that subgenre soon. But for some, they needed to take a break. And also, a lot of times when it comes to soft visuals, it does seem like this is just sort of a moment of pause, and then they jump back or they go to some other type of style. It's what happens when you have long careers. Some other bands, though, that came out as just regular soft visual is Glay and Sophia. They basically really... I don't believe they were in any other type of genre before soft visual, so they just sort of solidified that as just where Visual Kei was. And then what it allowed is basically for commercial success, for bands to be able to sell out those stadiums. It does make me think a little bit of Lunacy, while obviously Lunacy is very Visual Kei, and definitely... even looking at like their current content and stuff like that, you do see those like Visual Kei inspirations and like, you know, some of the pieces and outfits that they're wearing. Of course, there's moments of like toned downness, but then it makes me think of Sugizo, and he's always in his hot shorts, and things like that. So like it just all depends on like the style. It's whatever people kind of want. But basically, they were able to stay the same without necessarily changing their sound. They just sort of changed their look, and I'm not just talking about Lunacy in general. I'm just talking about soft visual in general, where it's like this became more palatable to the masses, and more people are willing to listen, and then that gives you more opportunity to have like stadium sold out shows, and also again more lucrative for the record label. But that's going to be part one. I think I'm going to at least have 3 parts to this, just because there are a lot of subgenres. Like I said, there's about 19. So this is where we're going to start. For the next couple of episodes, we'll continue on this path, and then we'll go back to regular programming where I look at different bands and talk about them. But I thought it would be really important, and especially for myself, to really understand the different subgenres. So when I'm talking about some of these bands, I already can make a connection to what I already know. Because again, my area of Visual Kei really falls under Oshade Kei, because I just love it, and sometimes Minhera Kei, because that became extremely popular, but a lot of the bands that I like do go towards that route. And so I want to sort of get an idea of what the overall different genres are, to make it a little bit more easier as I go through this podcasting journey. Again, feel free to leave a comment. Definitely feel free to comment, subscribe. You can find this podcast on Apple Music and Spotify, or on YouTube. I do live stream the sort of raw version of this podcast, and then I clean it up and then produce the actual podcast version that comes out on Wednesdays. If you have a band that you would like me to touch base on and talk about, please feel free to reach out and comment. And don't forget to subscribe and rate and review and things like that. That's crazy. But with that, I will be signing off. Bye.